Hello and welcome to State Scoop's Priorities Podcast. I'm Colin Wood, State Scoop's Editor-in-Chief. This week, you'll hear my interview with Lilian Coral, Vice President of New America's Technology and Democracy Programs, and Neil Kleiman, Urban Policy Professor at Northeastern University's Public Policy School. They provide an overview of New America's recent expansive report on how AI is being used and considered by state and local government leaders. But first, here's what's happening this week. A repurposed IT system being used by the Department of Homeland Security presents unacceptable risks to the nation's eligible voters, according to a group of secretaries of state who on Monday signed off on a letter opposing a recent proposal by the federal agency. The Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements program, also called SAVE, is subject to numerous legal changes under DHS's proposal, including that it would be used not for its original narrow purpose, but allow bulk searches and searches of individuals that are U.S. citizens by birth to find ineligible voters and instances of voter fraud. After numerous stalled attempts from the White House and Congress to preempt states from enforcing their artificial intelligence laws, yet another attempt is brewing in Congress, this time potentially bundling AI preemption with child online safety legislation. Doug Robinson, the executive director of the National Association of State Chief Information Officers, sent a letter to congressional leaders last week urging them to reject any such continued attempts at state AI law preemption, even one coupled with laws designed to protect kids. Two former committee chairs at the Association for Computing Machinery argue in a commentary piece for State Scoop that Congress must preserve state authority in AI governance. In that piece, they argue that AI's impact is happening now, not in some distant future, and that states must be permitted to create and enforce their own laws as the need arises. Before the Thanksgiving break, I caught up with New America's Lilian Coral and Neil Kleiman to hear about their last 2 years of research into state and local government AI policy. Their findings are in a report, which I encourage you to seek out because our conversation here doesn't cover everything. But what they do share is interesting, and they said the findings are encouraging. Take us back to the beginning of this project. How did this all begin?
Yeah, so Neil, my friend Neil Kleiman, Eric Gordon, and others and I started meeting in the fall of 2023, summer of 2023, fall 2023, really putting together our own thinking around the lessons of the civic tech movement, how we take them and carry on in this moment, and started to really design this concept of bringing about participatory research, right, being on the ground, doing pilots in communities, combining it with national research through the work that Neil and Mylene Garcia have done, interviewing CIOs and leaders across government. And then we also brought together a trust, what we call our Civic AI Trust, of real thought leaders in the space to help us design both the research and the pilots and inform that work. And so we've been working on this for almost 2 years now. And the report that we released in the early fall that Neil, Eric, and Mylene really spearheaded, that report really brings all of that thinking together.
Right. So you kind of referenced this somewhat, but in a little more detail, could one of you explain the methodology behind the report? How many people did you talk to? What sort of questions were you asking? What precisely were you trying to find out?
Well, what we found remarkable is everybody in the world is talking about AI and the implications, and we're particularly interested in the implications for local government, mainly cities, but also states as well. And we've been really surprised that there hadn't been a really holistic or comprehensive take on where the field is. There's certainly been a number of great policy reports out there, some just looking at cities, some just looking at states, but very few broadly and comprehensively looking at the field. And that's exactly what we did. And the other objective that we had is we're very much oriented towards the role of residents and communities. And so we both did a comprehensive snapshot, but then also with a goal of putting together a framework for how you can embrace AI while also rebuilding trust with residents.
Right. Well, I can tell you that I was really interested to see this report because I sort of, incidentally been doing the same thing through my work, of course, talking to state and local IT officials, noticing trends. And of course, it's hard to not notice that, whether you're in a job like this or not, that everyone is talking about AI. So what did you find? What were the main takeaways from your work that are featured in this report?
Why don't I go first and then would love for Lilian to chime in. I would say there were three big takeaways, and honestly, some of this was a surprise. I think a lot of us, the more we engage with AI, are a little surprised about where it takes us. So the first is around the technology itself. As civic tech champions, we've always been about how technology can truly open up government and the public sector. And I don't think it's gotten us that far over the past few decades, but AI has the possibility to truly level the playing field. When you can translate city government legislation into a fifth grade level, you're pretty much a lot of the way there. The other thing that we were struck by was the politics around this, right? Everybody is either excited or so freaked out about this technology that everybody is ready to do something. So for the first time, you have philanthropy, governments, universities, all at the same time saying we must do something. So the possibilities of working together are much higher than in the past, and we've seen that. And the third thing I would say that's really different is the approach to how to advance this technology. For the first time, and I've been looking at tech and local government since the late 90s, you really see states leading more than cities. And there's so many things to say about that. But what I would also say is really different is you're seeing, not to use a software term, but an enterprise approach, meaning rather than the tech development happening in an isolated office, the data office, the innovation office, or what have you, you see all of government trying to make sense of this technology at the same time. And there's so many positive benefits to that. The first one being that there's a commitment for everyone in the workforce to be trained who works for government. So it's not enough to just have your CIO and the CIO's team know the technology. We all have to have some sense of what AI is about, in a sense, data literacy. And the other thing in terms of the enterprise approach that we're seeing that's very positive is rather than just having some departments experiment, you're seeing this dynamic of walled gardens or sandboxing, in which governments are saying, let's create a safe space. We know this is secure. We know that we have confidence that we're not going to leak any of this data. And let's go crazy. Let's experiment with it. Let's be creative and then see how we want to advance this technology for all of government. So we're encouraged.
Right.
Yeah, I would just add, I think on the community front, Neil, my observation was that I think the opposites, right? The fear and then also the excitement, I think, are true in the public as well in government, right? Like you get your set of folks who are really scared to experiment, your set of folks who really want to try it. But what I was really encouraged by was actually the level of conversation that I could hear. I wasn't on the ground in some of these pilots, but through my colleagues, I could hear that, the residents had questions, but they had really informed questions. They wanted to know who owned their data. They wanted to know about data, where the data would live and persist, and if they would own it over the life cycle of these projects, because some of these community groups actually brought their own historical data to the conversation that we helped to digitize. So I thought I was really encouraged by, in a lot of my work, both as a city chief data officer or I worked in philanthropy and I would fund a lot of digital teams. And likewise, the fear is always that the public is not ready to have these discussions. And I'm always comforted by, I actually think that they're more ready than we give them credit for. And there's some wonderful surveys in California that the Carnegie Institute has done around AI that I think show that the public knows a little bit more about the risks and the opportunities than I think we often give it credit for. So that's really heartening. And then I would say the only other maybe perhaps observation building on top of what Neil said is I do think that again, we have a lot more experimentation and readiness this time around. And yes, that's because we are building on a legacy of 15 years of civic tech. And I would hope that as we think about how are we going to take advantage, or how are we going to mitigate the risks of this moment, that we don't forget that we have 15 years of infrastructure, capacity, training, learnings that we need to build on. And I think that's why cities or states are more ready to have the conversation. They're not. I do think it's interesting to note why states are leading more than perhaps cities are in this moment. But everybody, I think, comes to the table just more prepared, with more language, with more knowledge about what the possible pitfalls are. So that's also really heartening.
Right. All right. Well, you both laid out a bunch of great stuff for us to go a little deeper on. First, I want to ask one thing that's like a personal interest of mine. You named two categories of people: those who are excited and afraid. Maybe there's people in the middle of that Venn diagram also, but there's also a third category, which is the non-believers. Did you encounter any of that throughout your conversations? People who just think that this is a lot of hype, maybe not worth paying attention to, not especially interested, or was that somewhat rare?
I have to say, we did at least 50 interviews with government officials, community leaders, foundations. Not a single one has said that they don't think AI is going to have much of an impact. I think most people who are in sort of management roles or leadership roles are preparing for something. I'm not like vouching for everything that they're doing, but I don't think I've heard like, oh, we can just, the weebyism phrase, right? We be here before you, we'll be here after you, and just let's put our head in the sand. There was very little of that in terms of what's going out there on in the field.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Did you have something to add there, Lilian?
No,
okay.
Yeah. I think what everyone is still trying to determine is the level of impact, right? I think that's what we're all guessing on, but I don't think there's a sense that it's not going to have any impact. And I will say, I think one of the other just general observations post the release of the report and having more conversations with funders and partners in the space is just the recognition that a lot of people are already using AI in these systems anyway, right? And so we talk about shadow use of AI. So it's just so, and in fact, sometimes the shadow use is more concerning, right? Because it's not within these sandboxes, or it's not within the proprietary systems where you can really make sure the data is actually safe. So I think there's actually just a recognition that the users, a lot of these public sector employees actually, or nonprofit employees, is another space we worked with very closely, that they're actually maybe further ahead of us than we think we are. And so it's not like there's a wait and see moment where we're all going to adopt AI. I think a lot of it has already been slowly adopted anyway, and that's something we have to account for in the future.
The one thing I would add to what you were asking, Colin, which I think is close to what you're saying, is I did talk to a number of officials that said there is just such fear of job displacement within government, especially with cost cutting, that the conversation about how to use AI has been like literally shut down within a number of government agencies because of that fear, or union issues, or what have you. Sure. But what we also found, which I was really pleasantly surprised to see, is in a number of places, particularly within state governments, and I'm thinking of places like Colorado and Maryland, where there's been all kinds of, again, sandboxing, where you creatively play with AI, where they have really been struck by how much it allows staff to focus more on the most important aspects of their job. In a sense, the AI is drawing out more of the human elements of what they do. Like, imagine if you're in the healthcare field, or a teacher, or you're a cop, if you have more time to interact with people, right, rather than doing the mind-numbing administrative tasks in front of you, in a sense, it elevates your role. So I think we experienced a lot of that tension, but not any non-belief.
Sure. Yep. And that's matched my experience as well. A typical interview question I ask is, where do you place yourself on the AI optimism scale? And
right.
Pretty much everyone will return with a number between 7 and 9. And, it's always the usual there's some people who say, like, they'll admit like, hey, I'm really, really into AI, but for the most part, people will just say, I think this is really promising, but I don't have blinders on. I have my eyes open, and that's typical of any state or local IT official whose job is to keep that sort of 30,000-foot view. So, Lillian, you said something really interesting about the difference in or the sort of different roles that cities and states have played historically, or actually, maybe Neil, maybe you mentioned that. Actually, yes, it was you, Neil. So, can you say a little bit more about that? How you think the who is leading on AI has flipped a little bit, and how has that happened?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as many of your listeners and readers know this phrase quite well, smart cities, right? I think that captures it in a nutshell, that when we've had past waves of technological advancement, usually a lot of the pioneering efforts, or at least the ones we heard about, were happening in major cities like Los Angeles or Boston or New York or what have you. And a lot of times, not surprisingly, they were led by very charismatic mayors. So going all the way back to performance-based management, which is very data and tech oriented, right? Who was that led by? Steve Goldsmith in Indianapolis, Ed Rendell in Philadelphia, Rudy Giuliani in New York City, these outsized personalities that said, gosh darn it, we're going to use data and technology to improve services for our residents. And now more recently, you had folks like Michael Bloomberg in New York. Pete Buttigieg was amazing in South Bend. Eric Garcetti, who worked with Lilian in Los Angeles. Like, these are spokespeople. And in fact, a lot of that experimentation and innovation was happening at the municipal level. Now, flip it to what you're seeing now. There have been some cities that are moving forward on AI, but I don't think you can point to a mayor that has a track record of more than a year of saying we are committing our local government to AI. We're going to be the AI city for America or anything like that. But you do have a number of governors, and I've met with them, who are very committed to AI and have put together very thoughtful and in some cases forceful plans. Governor Newsom, of course, in California, Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Colorado, Utah, Maryland, New Jersey. Even as I'm talking to you, I'm thinking of all the states that have put together statewide plans, and more than that, are moving forward with a lot of experimentation. And again, we could talk about what some of the reasons for, like, why that's happening. But I would also say, like, we're encouraged by that, because as someone who's also worked a lot with cities over the years, one of the most challenging things for cities is engaging with your state government, right? And so to have your state government at least initially be supportive of moving forward is likely going to make this a lot easier for all the governments within a state to move in a positive, healthy direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a question for you here, Lillian. So, I assume you're familiar with the phrase "whole of state cybersecurity." This idea that states will not simply look after the executive branch, but establish resources and policies that include education and so forth. And I think that concept has kind of expanded to where that model seems, even if it's not explicitly created for something like AI, it's understood to be a reasonable way to go about implementing other technologies. In your interviews, did you guys come across those sorts of views when it comes to AI? Did people say that, we want to make AI available to the cities, or we want to work together with cities, or not so much?
I'll let Neil answer that, since he did the interviews himself, but I definitely can pick up a little bit on this whole.
Lillian, I think you should.
Okay. Well, I was well, the interesting dynamic to me about the whole of state and then with AI that I think is different than smart cities is that, I mean, states really set the funding and sort of the parameters for a lot of how city or county services really end up functioning. So to me, and from a technological perspective, it actually makes a ton of sense for the state to actually start to really build out that leadership. I think it's also the fact that we have more state level AI bills that are also going up in terms of guardrails and privacy protections that I think have also almost in some ways created opportunities for states to not only just lead with the guardrails, but also really lead on the implementation front. So I think that, to me, that all intuitively makes sense for why there's such a strong leadership with states. And what I will say from my own experience in California is I live in California, have worked in California, and now really I'm serving actually on the California Board of Governors, Community Colleges Board of Governors, and I see the whole of state where, again, there's a commitment from the governor to advance an AI future across state agencies, and then within the community college system, we're doing the same, right? Really trying to create a blueprint as part of our Vision 2030 plan to ensure that our colleges are innovating with the right kinds of privacy and guardrails, and then the various districts then are allowed to kind of innovate within that framework. And so to me, it's actually the way in which ideally we should have done the smart cities. Right. Having worked in city government, Neil is totally right. We never had the support of states, and frankly, even the financial supports that are really needed to do these kinds of modernizations well. So it's great to see the flip on the AI front. What I would hope, though, is that the resources do come to bear. So with the whole of government, the cybersecurity approach, how are we giving cities and counties the infrastructure to invest in their cybersecurity infrastructure or in their privacy mechanisms to ensure that the data is not just stored properly, but then also really shareable among city or county agencies or cities and counties, where we know a lot of the friction ends up happening from a service delivery standpoint, and we can never really extract the true value of the data that our systems have. So I'll just say it's great to see the flip. I would hope that we also start to see it from like an actual resourcing and then planning and coordination, which I think is where we will see the true benefits of all of this. But, it's still, I think we're still a little ways away, I would say, just to be honest, right? Because the level of coordination required is still, far from us.
Right. Well, with cybersecurity, that took federal legislation to make that level of coordination possible. With the state and local cybersecurity grant program. Sorry, go ahead, Neil. You were going to add something there.
No, I was just going to say, I think along those lines of the need for coordination, I think that's where you really see the potential danger, but also the real possibilities, is that the federal government has been absent in all of this. And so that's why I think states are trying to fill the vacuum, certainly in red states as well. And so I think it bodes for the possibilities of better coordination. But as Lilian said, it's not as though it's there yet, and certainly not the resources. So I think here's hoping, and here's why we do need those frameworks and that sort of alignment going forward.
Right. Well, even worse than absent, the federal government, especially, even as recent as last week, is trying to renew the preemption of state AI laws. So that's arguably worse than absent, trying to actively stop states from doing anything in terms of enforcing AI laws. But we won't. I heard your sigh. We won't get into that. So, Lilian, you said something really interesting about building on the civic tech legacy that we have, some 15 years of efforts surrounding various civic tech things. How does that figure into the AI efforts today?
Well, I think, and it's probably more than 15 years now. I use 15 as but what is time? No, I think I think the infrastructure, both people, right? We were able to attract a lot of talent throughout this 15 years into city governments. Various different funders have supported the expansion of innovation teams, digital service teams, data teams. So I think cities are just in a different position to even start this AI conversation than they would have been had, this taken off even 7 years before that. So I think the people, infrastructure, we also have just the history and the experience, right? We've had to deal with these waves of one of the biggest challenges, right, is a lot of cities feeling like vendors coming in to sell them snake oil, right? Well, we've already lived through multiple iterations of that. So I think cities are really a lot smarter about how to procure what real deliverables to put into their contracts, and how to really think about how to frame even contracts in a way that will give them the actual thing that they're looking for in terms of a software as service, right? Those kinds of details actually were lacking for us when I worked in city government, now close to 10 years ago. Oh my God. So, I think that there's just a lot of knowledge, expertise. There's a lot of talent out in cities. And I think that sets us up to have, a different kind of conversation. When I worked in city government, we were struggling, one, to find people who would come in to work at the kinds of salaries that we had money for. We were struggling with legal counsel who just had no idea about whose privacy construct was HIPAA or FERPA, and so we were like, everything was either a HIPAA issue or non-HIPAA issue. Now there's just so much complexity to understanding like privacy laws. And I just feel like we've made a huge dent there as a movement, and there's a lot of people out there to give credit to for that. And then the other thing too is, I would say lastly, I think now we have the opportunity to really, AI does actually give us an opportunity to get through a lot of the capacity constraints that cities had, right? We were never going to be able to, from a very data-centric perspective, hire the kinds of data scientists and pay them the kinds of salaries to stay on city staffs, to do all of the wonderful things we want to do with data that would help us understand who needs what service when, and be able to deliver that service quickly, right? We struggled with that level of talent, attraction, and sustainability from a financial perspective. And I just think these tools, the advancement of a lot of these AI tools, actually give cities more capacity and ability to do those kinds of really complicated, just to tackle more rich data problems than we would have ever been able to tackle 5-6 years ago. We just didn't have the people. We didn't have all of the talent that we could. So I think there's a ton of opportunity there and lots of lessons. And the last thing I'll just say is, the reason why I mentioned it is, I do think it is human instinct to start over every time something happens, and like, well, how are we going to tackle this? And I think a lot of what drew Neil, Eric, Anthony Townsend, and a lot of our colleagues together is like, we've done this before. We know what works. We know what doesn't work. We've made the same mistakes. Let's not do those again. And that's where we say, don't throw a baby out with the bathwater. Let's build on what we've got. And I think cities and states are doing that. So that's good to see.
Great. And Colin, if it's okay to build on what Lilian was saying, because I think that's the core of what makes our work so urgent, but also interesting, is that we've all worked together in different ways over the years. And now we have this opportunity, partly because Lilian's representing New America, the umbrella in which we're all under, but we're now all in positions at major engineering universities. And we've wanted to come together collectively, not so much as a mea culpa, but as much as what Lilian was saying, is to build on what we've learned over these many, many years, focusing on civic tech, which really just straight up civic tech is, how do you make people's lives better with technology? And I'm going to point the finger at myself here and say, I always felt if I held on to that, it would be enough, right? But yet, people have lost more faith in government over the years, even though we feel as though we've had so much success. And I think we felt if we led with efficiency, that would be enough. And it's not enough. And that's what led to us putting together this framework in the report that you might think is a bit of a cheeky title, but it's called ALT, right? And you could use that in all kinds of ways. But the way we use it as an acronym for Adapt, Listen, and Trust. And I think that acronym really captures how we feel we can build on those civic tech lessons, and it can be a great framework for local governments and communities going forward. And so ADAPT essentially means, in the past, we would use phones like this and programs like See, Click, Fix, right? Where you would take a picture of a pothole, send it to government, and things would get a lot better miraculously. And in fact, that's not what happened. A lot of the times you would have transportation agencies that were crushed and overwhelmed by all of those messages coming in. So adapt means to do something that governments are not prone to do, which is to be strategic and think ahead in terms of what this technology is going to do and how it changes demand. And listen goes to us in the civic tech movement, or at least me again, thinking, wow, if we just lobby for open data legislation, smart government, all that kind of thing, things will be okay. And then we realized a lot of that was a lot of data on websites, but didn't really lead to translation for residents. So we need to do it. And trust, the last one, and I think this is the most important one and the one we're most excited about, is I think AI presents the potential to change the data that we're working with. And this came up in the pilot effort we had in Dorchester, in which we worked with communities there in government that said, we don't want to have to do anything to do with AI. Right. And we also, the community is very skeptical of the police department. They want to focus on criminal justice. And we said, wait a second, we think there's a possibility here without spending a lot of money to create what we call a public common data corpus, meaning to match and to bring together traditional administrative data sets from the criminal justice system with what the community thinks. And we were able to do that with years of community notes and meetings and interviews and put that into a chat in which community members, but also the Boston Police Department, can ask basic questions about crime. And then what you get in return is a much more thoughtful, but no less succinct answer to some of the more pressing issues around crime in the community. So I think trust, and when we talk about earning back trust, is going to take a lot of effort in terms of rethinking what we've done in the past. But what we're excited about AI is I think the possibilities are there to reimagine even something like data in a way that incorporates community perspectives and wisdom.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the big shift really is, I think the big eye-opening lesson of all of this is that we just shifted to really focusing on community, right? Like that's really what ALT is about, what the report and a lot of our work ended up being about, is just centering the community and defining problems, centering their questions, centering their data. And then really, if we did that, that's where we started to see the possibility of creating the trust that we had always sought to do, right, as civic technologists, build greater trust, but that we had done through a very institutional lens. And I think what we're trying to do with Rethink AI is actually rethink that opportunity.
That was Lilian Coral and Neil Kleiman. That's it for this episode. You can subscribe to the Priorities Podcast at prioritiespodcast.com. This recording is a production of Scoop News Group in Washington, D.C. Adam Butler and Carlin Fisher helped put it together. I'm Colin Wood. Thanks for listening.